On a September morning in 1944, specifically the 19th day of that month, near a French town called Arracourt in the northeastern region, a German officer, Hans Weber, prepared for combat. He climbed into his Panther Ausführung tank with the assurance that came from 2 full years of battlefield experience. His vehicle was one among 43 Panthers assigned to the 113th Panzer Brigade, and he believed it represented the finest armored fighting vehicle that existed anywhere in the world at that time. The Panther's weight reached 45 tons, and it carried a long-barreled 75mm KWK-42L 70 cannon capable of piercing 138mm of armor plating at 1,000-meter distances. Its front armor measured 80mm thick, sloped at a 55-degree angle, which provided protective effectiveness equivalent to roughly 140mm against armor-piercing ammunition. Weber had personally witnessed Tiger tanks absorb multiple Sherman rounds without suffering any meaningful damage. He had observed American tanks erupting in flames after receiving single hits from his own weapon system. Weber's crew had participated in the massive battle at Kursk, withdrawn through Ukrainian territory under pressure, and retreated across Polish lands. They understood their machine intimately. They placed complete trust in its capabilities. The Panther could eliminate a Sherman at ranges where the Sherman's 75mm M3 gun proved nearly worthless against German frontal protection. The mathematics were straightforward and unforgiving. The American 75mm weapon firing standard M61 armor-piercing ammunition could penetrate approximately 60mm of armor, 1,000-meter distance. When faced with the Panther's sloped frontal plate, this proved entirely insufficient. Sherman tanks would need to approach within 500 meters or closer to have any realistic possibility of frontal penetration. And even at that distance, success depended on striking weak points like the gun mantlet or lower hull sections. Weber and his crew received their briefing that morning. Intelligence indicated American armor was operating in the surrounding area, belonging to the 4th Armored Division supporting 3rd Army's advance toward German borders. Reports identified standard M4 Shermans, identical to the tanks German crews had been destroying throughout the Normandy campaign and during the pursuit across French territory. The assigned mission was straightforward in its objectives. They would advance, locate American armor, destroy it from distance, and maintain control of the ground. This represented exactly what Panther tanks excelled at performing. What Weber did not know, what German intelligence had failed to properly communicate, and what would completely shatter the comfortable assumptions held by German tank crews across the entire front, was that not all Sherman tanks remained the same anymore. American forces had been learning from their experiences, adapting their equipment, making improvements, and advancing toward Weber's position that morning were tanks that would fundamentally alter the mathematical calculations of armored warfare throughout the Western Front. The German confidence in their armored superiority was not mere arrogance or empty boasting. It had been earned through bitter combat experiences across multiple battlefronts and confirmed by observable battlefield realities. When the Wehrmacht invaded Polish territory in September of 1939, German tanks were not particularly impressive as specifications. The Panzer III mounted a short 37mm gun. The Panzer IV carried a short 75mm weapon designed primarily for supporting infantry operations. These tanks achieved success through superior doctrine and tactical employment rather than through raw firepower or protective armor. The encounter with French heavy tanks during 1940 revealed uncomfortable truths to German commanders. The French Char B1 bis, with its 60mm of frontal armor, could shrug off standard German anti-tank fire. French Simua S-35 cavalry tanks possessed better armament and armor than most German vehicles in service. The British Matilda to infantry tank proved nearly impervious to standard German anti-tank guns. Germany won the battle for France through superior tactics, close air support, and operational mobility. not through tank versus tank superiority. The invasion of Soviet territory in June of 1941 brought even more shocking revelations to German tank crews. They encountered the T-34 medium tank and KV-1 heavy tank, both of which possessed armor protection and armament superior to anything in the German arsenal at that time. The T-34's sloped armor design, wide tracks providing mobility through mud and snow, and powerful 76mm gun made it a formidable opponent on any battlefield. The KV-1, with armor reaching up to 90mm thick, could withstand hits from every German tank gun then in active service. These encounters drove German tank development in entirely new directions. The result was the Panther, developed specifically as a countermeasure to the T-34 and introduced in combat at Kursk during July of 1943. Despite experiencing mechanical problems in its initial battlefield deployment, the Panther quickly proved itself as a superior tank destroyer. Its long 75mm gun could engage enemy armor at extreme ranges that other tanks could not match. Its sloped armor, directly inspired by the T-34's design principles, provided excellent protection against most Allied guns in service. By the time American forces conducted their landing operations in Normandy in June of 1944, German tank crews had refined their tactical doctrine extensively. They understood their advantages with complete clarity. They possessed superior optics that allowed them to spot targets at longer ranges than their opponents. They had more powerful guns that could penetrate Allied armor before Allied guns could respond effectively. And in the case of the Panther and Tiger, they had armor protection that could resist most Allied anti-tank weapons in the field. German crews fought defensively, using terrain features and engagement range to maximize these inherent advantages. The standard American M4 Sherman, which began arriving in North African theaters during late 1942 and formed the backbone of American armored forces through the Normandy campaign, was designed according to different specifications and priorities. American doctrine emphasized reliability, ease of maintenance, and mass production capability over individual tank superiority in single combat. The Sherman was powered by various engine types depending on the specific variant, but most commonly used either a radial aircraft engine or a Ford GA AV8 engine. It proved reliable in operation, with track systems that could last over 2,000 miles before requiring replacement. It had a radio communication system installed in every tank, enabling coordinated operations across entire units. It featured a gyroscopic stabilizer for the main gun, allowing reasonably accurate fire while the vehicle was moving across terrain. But its 75mm M3 gun, while effective against earlier German tank models and excellent when performing the infantry support role, was increasingly inadequate when facing Panthers and Tigers. The Sherman's armor protection, though well sloped on the front hull sections, was thin by European combat standards. American tank crews developed specific tactics to compensate for these disadvantages, using numerical superiority and maneuver warfare to flank German heavy tanks, attacking from the sides or rear where armor protection was thinner. But this tactical approach required multiple Sherman tanks working together in coordination, accepting losses to achieve successful kills. The informal understanding among American tank crews was that it required 5 Sherman tanks to eliminate 1 Panther. 4 of those Shermans would be destroyed in the attempt to accomplish this objective. German tank crews in late 1944 had substantial reasons for their battlefield confidence. They had been winning the majority of tank versus tank engagements since the Normandy landings, despite being consistently outnumbered. After-action reports from panzer units repeatedly describe the same tactical pattern developing across multiple engagements. German crews would spot American armor at long range, engage at distances exceeding 1,000 meters, destroy multiple Sherman tanks before they could close to effective firing range. then withdraw before American numerical advantages became overwhelming and tactically decisive. The lead Sherman mounting a 76mm gun fired at the first Panther from approximately 400 meters. The round struck the lower side hull, penetrated through, and detonated ammunition stored inside. The Panther exploded violently, its turret separating from the hull and flying several meters through the air. The second Panther attempted to reverse away from the ambush, but was engaged by another 76mm equipped Sherman. 3 rounds were fired in rapid succession to penetrate the armor successfully. The Panther was disabled completely and abandoned by its crew. The mathematics of the new tactical situation became clear through repeated engagements across multiple days. The 76mm gun, while still unable to reliably penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at long range, could defeat the side armor at any combat range that crews were likely to encounter. The Panther's side armor measured only 40 to 50mm thick, far less protective than the 80mm frontal plate. At ranges under 1,000 meters, the 76mm gun had sufficient penetration capability to go through cleanly and cause internal damage. More troubling for German crews was the gradual realization that even frontal engagements were no longer completely safe as they had been previously. While the Panther's frontal hull armor remained largely impervious to 76mm fire, the turret proved more vulnerable than expected. The turret front measured 100mm thick, but at certain angles and ranges under 800 meters, particularly when striking the gun mantlet area, where armor was effectively thinner due to curvature, penetrations were definitely possible and occurring regularly. German tank crews, who had grown accustomed to frontal immunity at typical combat ranges, now had to reconsider their entire tactical approach. The Battle of Arracourt lasted through late September with continuous engagements. By the time it concluded, the 113th Panzer Brigade had been effectively destroyed as a combat formation. German records indicate the loss of at least 41 Panther tanks, nearly the entire brigade strength. The 111th Panzer Brigade, which reinforced the attack during the battle, lost an additional 37 Panthers and Panzer IV tanks combined. American losses were significant, but sustainable within their logistics system. Approximately 48 Sherman tanks destroyed or damaged during the battle, but most of which were recovered, repaired, and returned to active service within days, sometimes within hours of being hit. For German tank crews who survived Arracourt and similar engagements occurring across the front during autumn of 1944, a fundamental assumption about armored warfare had been completely shattered. The Panther was no longer invulnerable at typical combat ranges. American tanks were no longer easy prey that could be destroyed at leisure from 1,000 meters or more while remaining safe from return fire. The battlefield had changed fundamentally, and the German advantage in tank versus tank combat had narrowed considerably in just a few months. Weber survived Arracourt. He was among the fortunate few from his company who successfully made it back to German lines after abandoning his burning Panther. In the weeks that followed, as he was reassigned to a replacement Panther and a new crew of soldiers he had never worked with before, he had substantial time to process what had happened during that battle. The experience had fundamentally altered his understanding of armored warfare on the Western Front. In interviews conducted after the war ended, Weber and other German tank crews who fought during late 1944 and early 1945 described a profound shift in their tactical thinking and psychological approach to combat. The comfortable superiority they had enjoyed throughout the summer months, the knowledge that they could engage American armor at ranges where return fire was ineffective, had disappeared completely. They now had to assume that any Sherman tank they encountered might be equipped with the longer 76mm gun. They had to assume that their armor, while still formidable and better than American tanks, was no longer an absolute guarantee of survival in combat. This psychological change rippled through German panzer units across the entire Western Front over the following months. Tactical doctrine that had emphasized aggressive engagement at long range gave way to more cautious approaches that prioritized survival. Panther tanks that had previously positioned themselves to dominate open ground now sought cover and concealment more actively. Engagement ranges decreased steadily as German crews recognized they could no longer rely on distance alone to provide safety from American fire. The hunter mentality, the sense that German tank crews were the predators and Allied tanks were prey to be harvested, diminished significantly. German training materials and tactical guidance documents were updated to reflect the new battlefield reality. Documents from late 1944 warned crews about the improved American tank guns in specific terms and emphasized the critical importance of first shot kills. German gunners were instructed to aim for specific weak points on Sherman tanks, particularly the ammunition storage areas and engine compartments, to ensure complete kills rather than merely scoring hits that left the tank operational. The guidance acknowledged implicitly what many crews had learned through bitter combat experience. American tanks were becoming more dangerous as opponents. With every passing month, the industrial and strategic context made this tactical shift even more devastating for German forces attempting to continue the war. If the battlefield had been level in terms of equipment quality and quantity, German tactical adjustments might have maintained parity or even advantage. But the battlefield was not level by any measure. American tank production continued at rates that Germany could not possibly match with its industrial capacity. By late 1944, the United States was producing approximately 1,500 tanks per month across all types and variants. Germany's tank production, despite Albert Speer's extensive efforts to rationalize manufacturing processes and increase output through organizational reforms, peaked at approximately 350 tanks per month in December of 1944. Every Panther lost at Arracourt or in similar engagements across other sectors was difficult to replace and required extensive industrial capacity. Trained crews were becoming increasingly scarce as casualties mounted steadily and training time decreased under pressure. Fuel shortages limited movement capabilities and training opportunities. The overall logistical situation deteriorated continuously as Allied strategic bombing disrupted transportation networks throughout Germany. Meanwhile, American armor units that lost tanks in combat received replacement vehicles within days of reporting losses. Crews who survived disabled tanks were quickly reassigned to new vehicles and returned to combat operations. The material advantage the Americans had always possessed in industrial capacity was now being supplemented by a closing technical gap in equipment quality. For American tank crews, the 76mm gun represented validation of their complaints and enormous relief. Crews who had fought through Normandy with 75mm guns, who had watched their rounds bounce harmlessly off German armor while taking devastating return fire that killed their friends, now had a weapon that could fight more effectively and improve their survival chances. The psychological impact was significant and measurable. Tank commanders who had previously avoided engagement with Panther tanks when possible now could engage with reasonable confidence, particularly if they could maneuver four-side shots where German armor was thinner. The confidence this inspired showed clearly in after-action reports and combat effectiveness assessments. Sherman crews with 76mm guns reported higher morale levels and greater willingness to engage German armor when encountered. Officers noted improved tactical aggressiveness and measurably reduced casualties in armored engagements. The weapon did not make the Sherman equal to the Panther in all circumstances and combat situations, but it made the fight considerably more even. It made survival more likely for men whose job required them to advance toward enemy positions in relatively thin-skinned vehicles. That psychological shift was invaluable for combat effectiveness. American ordnance continued improving the ammunition for the 76mm gun through ongoing development programs. In January of 1945, the M93 hypervelocity armor-piercing round became available for issue to combat units. This projectile used a tungsten carbide core material and achieved a muzzle velocity of 3,400 feet per second, substantially higher than the earlier M62 round. The M93 could penetrate approximately 149 millimeters of armor, 1,000 meter distance, sufficient to defeat a Panther's frontal armor at combat ranges under ideal conditions. The round was expensive to produce and manufactured in limited quantities due to tungsten shortages, but its availability gave American crews an additional edge in critical engagements where frontal shots were unavoidable. The story of the 76mm Sherman and its impact on German tank crew psychology was not an isolated incident in military history. It represented a broader pattern evident throughout the war's final year. German technological and tactical advantages were eroding steadily under the weight of Allied material superiority and continuous improvement programs. The same dynamic that played out with tanks was occurring simultaneously with aircraft, artillery systems, logistics capabilities, and nearly every other aspect of military capability that determined combat outcomes. German jets like the Messerschmitt Me 262 represented a genuine technological leap forward in aircraft design, but they were produced in insufficient numbers and operated under such severe fuel and pilot shortages that their overall impact on the air war was limited. German developments in rocket technology, guided missiles, and advanced submarine designs came too late and into few numbers to affect strategic outcomes. The V2 rocket was a technical marvel that killed thousands of civilians in London and Antwerp, but it consumed enormous resources that might have been better spent on conventional weapons that could affect battlefield outcomes. The fundamental problem Germany faced by late 1944 was that the nation was fighting enemies with vastly superior industrial capacity, while its own industrial base was being systematically destroyed by strategic bombing campaigns. The Allies could afford to produce good enough weapons in overwhelming quantities while continuously improving them through iterative development. Germany could produce excellent weapons that were often superior in individual technical specifications, but not enough of them, not quickly enough, and not with sufficient resources to sustain production as infrastructure deteriorated under bombing pressure. The Sherman equipped with the 76mm gun was not the best tank of the entire war. That distinction arguably belonged to the German Panther, at least in terms of the balance between firepower, armor protection, and mobility in a single package. But the Sherman was good enough for its intended purposes, and it was available in numbers that made tactical and strategic victory possible for Allied forces. By the end of the war in Europe, the United States had produced approximately 49,000 Sherman tanks in all variants combined. Germany produced approximately 6,000 Panther tanks total. The ratio was more than 8-1. And that calculation did not even account for Soviet, British and other Allied tank production adding to the disparity. American tactical doctrine had always emphasized the combined arms approach to warfare. Sherman tanks were not expected to defeat German heavy tanks in single combat duels. They were expected to work cooperatively with tank destroyers, artillery support, close air support, and infantry forces to accomplish assigned missions. The 76mm gun made Sherman tanks more capable in the anti-tank role specifically, but it did not fundamentally change American tactical doctrine or operational approach. What it did change was the balance of risk in tank versus tank engagements, making those encounters considerably more survivable for American crews who had to fight them. For German crews, the experience of watching their carefully cultivated advantages disappear was profoundly demoralizing at multiple levels. They had entered the war with technological and tactical superiority over most opponents they faced. They had maintained that superiority to the middle years of the war through continuous improvement programs and accumulated combat experience. But by late 1944, they were being overtaken by opponents with greater resources. Their tanks were still individually superior in many respects and specific combat situations, but the margin of superiority was shrinking continuously, while the numerical disadvantage was growing larger with each passing month. The psychological impact of this realization extended far beyond tank crews to the broader German military and civilian population. If the Wehrmacht's best tanks could be defeated by improved Allied weapons, if German technological advantages could be neutralized by enemy industrial capacity and continuous improvement, what realistic hope remained for achieving victory in this war? The propaganda narratives that had sustained German morale for years, the stories of German technical superiority and fighting spirit overcoming material disadvantages, became increasingly difficult to maintain credibly in the face of battlefield realities that contradicted those narratives daily. Weber returned to combat operations after Arracourt with a new tank and a completely new crew of soldiers he had to train. He carried this knowledge with him into every subsequent engagement. He had personally witnessed his supposedly invulnerable Panther penetrated at range by a weapon that should not have been capable of such a feat according to the intelligence briefings he had received. He had watched his experienced gunner die in an engagement that tactical doctrine stated his tank should have dominated completely. He knew with certainty that every Sherman tank he encountered might be equipped with the longer gun that could kill his tank. He knew that American numerical superiority meant that even favorable exchange rates, where Germans killed more tanks than they lost, were ultimately losing propositions in a war of attrition. He continued to fight because he was a soldier in an army that executed deserters without hesitation, and because his family remained in Germany under the constant threat of Allied strategic bombing. But the confidence he had felt that morning in September, the certainty that his tank and his training made him inherently superior to American opponents, was completely gone and would never return. He fought now with the knowledge that survival was increasingly a matter of luck and circumstances, rather than skill or equipment quality alone. By the time the war in Europe ended, in May of 1945, the transformation of American armored forces was complete and undeniable. The Sherman tanks rolling into Germany and Austria accepting the surrender of Wehrmacht units were not the same vehicles that had landed on Normandy beaches 11 months earlier. They were better armed with improved guns, better trained crews with combat experience, and supported by a logistical system that could sustain operations indefinitely without the fuel and ammunition shortages that plagued German forces. The M4 A3E8 EZ8 combining the 76mm gun with improved suspension and other mechanical refinements represented the culmination of continuous improvement undertaken under actual combat conditions. German tank crews who survived the war, who were interviewed by Allied intelligence officers immediately after surrender and later by military historians, consistently described a specific moment when they realized the Americans had closed the technical gap sufficiently. For some crews, like Weber's, that moment came at Arracourt during September. For others, it came in the Ardennes region during the Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944, when German forces threw their remaining armor reserves into a last desperate offensive operation designed to split Allied armies and recapture the vital port of Antwerp. American tank destroyers and 76mm equipped Sherman tanks destroyed hundreds of German tanks during that battle, including many of the newest Panther and King Tiger variants representing Germany's most advanced armor technology. The Battle of the Bulge demonstrated conclusively that German armor, while still formidable when properly employed, could be defeated systematically by American weapons in American hands when supported by superior logistics and air power. The initial German advance achieved some tactical success through surprise, poor weather that grounded Allied aircraft, and sheer weight of numbers concentrated at weak points in American lines. But once American forces stabilized the defensive lines and brought their full firepower to bear, the outcome was inevitable and predictable. German tanks ran out of fuel on the roads, were destroyed by American weapons in increasing numbers, or were simply abandoned by crews who recognized the futility of continuing operations without support. The surviving Panther and Tiger tanks that retreated back into German territory in early 1945 were essentially museum pieces, technologically impressive but strategically irrelevant to determining the war's outcome. They lacked adequate fuel supplies for operations, spare parts for maintenance, and properly trained crews to operate them effectively. They were hunted constantly by American aircraft that dominated the skies completely. The lesson that emerged clearly from this historical experience, the enduring truth that military historians and strategic planners have studied extensively in the decades since the war ended, is that technological superiority is only one factor among many in determining warfare outcomes. Industrial capacity, logistics capabilities, training systems, tactical doctrine, and the organizational ability to learn and adapt rapidly from combat experience all matter enormously in sustained conflicts. Germany produced excellent tanks that were often superior to Allied equivalents in technical specifications, but Germany could not produce enough of them to matter strategically, could not fuel them adequately due to oil shortages, could not replace losses quickly enough to maintain force strength, and could not adapt its industrial base to compete effectively with enemies whose factories were completely beyond the reach of German weapons. The United States produced good tanks that met their design requirements, not the best tanks by individual technical measures, but good enough tanks in quantities that allowed complete tactical and strategic flexibility. When shortcomings were identified through combat experience, American industry could respond with modifications. When the 75mm gun proved inadequate against German heavy armor, a better gun was rapidly developed, tested extensively, produced in quantity, and fielded to frontline units within months. When weaknesses in armor protection or ammunition storage were discovered through battle damage analysis, modifications were designed and implemented across the production line. The system worked effectively not because American tanks were individually superior in all categories, but because American industrial capacity and organizational flexibility allowed continuous improvement at scale. Across entire armies, for Weber and the thousands of other German tank crews who lived through the transformation they witnessed, the experience was a profound study in the cost of strategic miscalculation at the highest levels of government. Germany had chosen to initiate a war against enemies with overwhelming industrial advantages while failing to develop the economic and industrial base necessary for sustained modern warfare across multiple fronts simultaneously. German tanks were genuine works of engineering excellence that impressed even their enemies. But engineering excellence alone could not overcome the basic arithmetic of industrial production when fighting enemies who could outproduce Germany by factors of 8 or 10 to 1. The morning Weber climbed into his Panther near Arracourt, feeling confident in his machine and his extensive training, represented the end of an era in armored warfare doctrine. The moment that 76mm round penetrated his turret armor and killed his gunner marked the beginning of a new reality, one where German advantages had been neutralized through Allied industrial effort and the material weight of Allied industrial power would grind down resistance regardless of individual technical superiority in specific weapon systems. The psychological journey from confidence through realization to grim acceptance of inevitable defeat played out across the German military in the war's final months. The Sherman tanks that German crews had mocked as tin cans and death traps were still vulnerable to German fire. They still burned when hit by armor-piercing rounds. They still required numerical superiority to overcome German heavy tanks in many combat circumstances, but they were no longer helpless targets. The 76mm gun combined with improved tactics, overwhelming numbers, and an industrial base that could absorb losses and continue producing indefinitely made them effective enough for their mission requirements. In modern warfare between industrial nations with developed economies, effective enough in sufficient quantity, defeats technically superior in limited numbers almost every time. That lesson learned at places like Arracourt through the deaths of men like Weber's gunner in burning tanks, scattered across the battlefields of France and Germany remains directly relevant to military planning and strategic thinking in the present day. Technological advantage is valuable and worth pursuing, but it must be sustainable over time. Excellence in individual weapon systems matters for tactical outcomes, but it must be supported by an industrial and logistical base capable of producing and maintaining those systems at scale across extended campaigns. And the confidence that comes from tactical superiority, the certainty that one's equipment is better than the enemy's and will therefore prevail, can evaporate in seconds when that equipment fails to perform as expected under the pressure of combat, reality against an adaptive opponent. The broader implications of the Arracourt battle and similar engagements extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. On those specific battlefields, they demonstrated that warfare in the industrial age had become as much about production capacity and logistics as about battlefield tactics and individual soldier or crew skills. The German army had entered the war with some of the world's finest military equipment and best trained soldiers. But these advantages proved insufficient when facing enemies who could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. Every engagement where German tanks achieved favorable kill ratios against Allied armor was ultimately meaningless if those Allied tanks were replaced within days, while German tanks required weeks or months to replace. The mathematics of attrition warfare favored the side with greater industrial capacity, and by 1944 this reality had become undeniable. The development and deployment of the 76mm gun Sherman also illustrated the importance of responsive military procurement and development systems. The American system, despite its many bureaucratic inefficiencies and political complications, proved capable of identifying problems, developing solutions, testing them adequately, and deploying them to combat units in a time frame that affected the war's outcome. German procurement, by contrast, was often hampered by competing bureaucratic empires, Hitler's personal interference in technical decisions, and a tendency to pursue perfection over practicality. The result was weapons like the King Tiger tank, which was technically superior to anything the Allies fielded, but produced in such small numbers and plagued by such mechanical unreliability that its impact on the war was minimal. American doctrine accepted that individual American tanks might be inferior to German counterparts, but compensated through combined arms tactics, superior numbers, and continuous improvement of existing designs rather than constant pursuit of entirely new weapon systems. The human cost of these strategic and industrial decisions was measured in the lives of tank crews on both sides who fought and died in vehicles that were ultimately just tools of national policy. Weber's gunner, who died at Arracourt, was one of hundreds of thousands of German soldiers killed in armored vehicles during the war. American tank crews suffered similar casualties throughout the campaign, with burn injuries being particularly common and horrific. The nickname Tommy Cooker was not an exaggeration. Sherman tanks with gasoline engines and ammunition stored in vulnerable locations did burn frequently when hit. American tankers knew the risks they faced every time they climbed into their vehicles. The introduction of the 76mm gun and wet ammunition storage reduced these risks, but did not eliminate them. Tank warfare remained one of the most dangerous jobs in any army, with crews operating in cramped, poorly ventilated spaces filled with ammunition and fuel, often exposed to enemy fire from multiple directions. The psychological strain of this constant danger, knowing that a single enemy round could penetrate armor and kill everyone inside within seconds, took a tremendous toll on crews from all nations. German tank crews in late 1944 and early 1945 faced additional psychological burdens beyond the immediate danger of combat. They were increasingly aware that Germany was losing the war. The optimistic propaganda broadcasts from Berlin rang hollow when compared to the reality of continuous retreat, constant Allied air superiority, and growing shortages of fuel, ammunition, and basic supplies. Tank crews who had fought since the early war years had watched Germany's position deteriorate steadily. The confident advance into France in 1940 seemed like ancient history. The vast expanses of the Soviet Union, where German armor had initially achieved spectacular victories, were now battlefields where Soviet forces pushed relentlessly westward with massive numerical superiority. The Western Front that had seemed secure to defeating France was now German territory itself, as Allied armies advanced from France into the Rhineland and beyond. For soldiers like Weber, continuing to fight required either fanatical belief in Nazi ideology, which many professional soldiers did not share, or a more pragmatic calculation that surrender meant uncertain fate as prisoners, while fighting at least offered the possibility of protecting their families and homeland for a few more weeks or months. The collapse of German armored superiority that became evident at Arracourt and similar battles represented more than just a tactical or technical development. It symbolized the broader collapse of German military capability under the pressure of multi-front warfare against enemies with superior resources.